I did a number of jobs before I became a teacher. In fact, my first job was as a school student, and I didn't enjoy school very much because nobody was interested in what I was interested in. They just wanted me to learn their stuff. I was quite good at learning their stuff, but I thought they should be interested in me as a person and in what I was interested in. And as far back as I can remember as a kid, this was one of my key feelings about school. So when I left school, I worked as in a psychiatric community for young people. And in this community, the therapy wasn't drugs or medicine or electric shocks. The therapy was just talking and living together in a community. And the so-called mentally ill got better and went to live normal lives in the community. And this seemed to me a very good way of people working together, just to live together in a system of equality and democracy. So I thought, why aren't schools like this? So I went to train as a teacher, and I learned about Pavlov and about Skinner. And so I felt, wait a minute, I don't want to teach rats and I don't want to teach dogs, I want to teach kids. So I'm not interested in behaviour management, but I'm interested in learning. So I went to the library, I stopped going to the lectures and went to a library and read some more interesting books by people who'd written about democratic schools. People like A.S. Neal, Homer Lane, John Dewey, etc. There's a list of people. And when I got my first job in a school, I tried to create an environment where children could learn about the things they were really interested in, and they could talk to each other with a lot of talking, not just writing. Because it seemed to me, if you're going to have people who are going to grow up to be citizens in a democracy, they have to learn to speak. They have to find a voice for themselves and the confidence to argue, to have a different opinion to the next person, and to be able to justify their opinion. So my first job was a great job. I had 36 kids who'd failed an examination at 11 to decide whether they would go to the academic school for university or to the not academic school. Many of the parents were themselves university people, so they felt their kids' life had come to an end. It was a disaster. Their kids had failed this examination. So it was possible with these parents to create an environment in my class. I had the class, although it was a secondary school, they came to me for history, geography, English, social studies, religious education, about 60% of the school week. So we sat together in a circle on the first day. How are we going to manage the class? And I explained that history was about everything that happened in the past, geography was about everything that's going on around the world, social studies was about how people learn to live together, religious education was about the things that people believed, and English was about how we communicate. So one of the kids said, "Please, Mr. Hannan, does that mean we can study anything?" So I said, "Yes, you can study anything, as long as you're really interested in it." And some kids worked on their own, mostly they worked in groups, and they studied things they were really interested in. And at first they did their work in writing, but then they began to teach lessons to the other kids in the things they'd been finding out about. And then they began to create a class newspaper. Instead of writing in books, they wrote on pieces of paper and put it on the wall of the classroom. And at first it was one wall, and then 2 walls, and then 3 walls, and then the windows, and then the door, and eventually, finally, I didn't write much on the blackboard, so they covered the blackboard with newspaper as well. And this was how the work was presented. The head teacher thought maybe I was crazy, but parents began to telephone him and say, "Our kids have never been so happy in school. They failed the examination at 11 and lost all their confidence. Now their confidence is coming back. They're beginning to be interested in the world. They're asking us questions at breakfast. We're very happy with what's happening to our children." Now, head teachers are political animals, so if the parents are happy, usually the head teacher is happy. And so after 1 year, he said, "I like what you're doing. I want to put you in charge of all the 8 classes of kids this age." This was a bit strange because I thought probably I'd get fired for working this way. I had some very funny experiences because one day the head teacher brought some other teachers to visit my class. They came into the room and it was completely quiet, but I wasn't there. And this was breaking a school rule, because in this school the teacher was supposed to be always in the classroom to control the kids. So he said to me, "Derry," he said, "you weren't in your class." I said, "No." He said, "But who was controlling the kids?" I said, "They were." "You know they were, because the class was quiet." One of the visiting teachers said to the kids, "Why is it quiet in here?" And the boy who was the chair of the class meeting at the time said, "Well, we have our own laws in this class. And one of our laws is if the class gets too noisy, because normally we're talking all the time, if 5 people put their hands up, we have 5 minutes quiet so that everyone can start to think again." The visiting teacher said, "Oh, that's an interesting idea. Was this your teacher's idea?" And they said, "No, it was our idea. Our teacher is a bit soft. And if we didn't have our own class government, it would be chaos in here. So we have class government." So one of the teachers said, "Well, what happens if people break the rules?" "Oh, easy," said this boy, "we have a class court. And on Friday afternoon, somebody, if they've broken the rules, if they talk in the quiet time, they have to come up to the court and explain why they did what they did. And then the court will give them, maybe it says, 'Okay, we understand,' or maybe it says, 'No, you broke the rules, you have to do something useful for the class, like organise the books or clean the blackboard,' if we had a blackboard, which we didn't by this time. Something useful." Something very funny happened later. I had a really funny experience. Now, when I became a head teacher, my attitude to the newspapers was a very cautious one. What I used to do was give them lots of good news, and they print it, and all the parents and grandparents and uncles and aunts will buy the newspaper because it's got their name, the name of their child in it. I tried to manage the press, but at this time I was very naive, and when one of the parents said, "A relative of mine is a reporter on a newspaper and would like to come and visit your class with a photographer." So I said, "Okay, sounds okay." First I discussed it with the kids. So we had the class meeting. Did we want the newspaper to come? "Yes," said the kids, "because we have our own newspaper all over the walls. It will be interesting to meet people from a real newspaper." And this newspaper was The Sun, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch. It's not a very good paper. In fact, I really don't like it. But I said yes. One thing I forgot to do, I forgot to tell the head teacher that the reporter and the photographer was coming. He was a bit angry about it later. But never mind, they came, and I noticed that one of the boys, who usually was quite well behaved in the class, didn't break the rules. In the few days before the newspaper were coming, he broke all the class rules. And we all wondered, what's he up to? What's he doing? Why is he breaking all the rules? And then we realised, when the reporter came, he was quite interested in the class meeting. And the kids said, what's it like to work on a real newspaper, and blah, 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 blah. But the photographer just sat there. Then we had the class court, and the photographer got his camera up. And this is what they'd really come to see, the class court. And of course, this boy Ian, who'd broken all the rules, he was in court. And he knew he would be, because he hoped it would be his picture in the newspaper. So he was really rather clever. And it was. The photographer took some pictures, and they took a picture of me with my hand up, waiting for permission to speak in the court. And I thought, oh God, what have I done? What's going to happen now? We'll get a very hostile report about kids punishing kids. But it wasn't. It was a very nice report. And the newspaper paid for a bus. This was 80 kilometres from London. Paid for a bus to take the kids to London. And the day their story was in the newspaper, the kids had the first 36 copies to come from the printing press, and the editor signed each copy and gave them to the kids. And it was a nice report about children learning about democracy by doing democracy, which was absolutely what I wanted them to print, and the parents were very happy. and the kids all kept their copy of the report. Well, there was a nice end to this story, because 40 years later I was writing a book about this class, about creating a democratic learning community in an ordinary state secondary school. And while I was writing, on my Facebook, bing, and there's a face, a bald-headed man in his 50s. He said, "You won't remember me, but I was Andrew in your class 40 years ago. I'm now a head teacher of a primary school. I work in a very democratic way, and I'm training other head teachers how to make more democracy in their schools." So I thought that's really beautiful. It shows that 40 years later it wasn't a waste of time, but these ideas have lasted. And he got a geography degree, he went to university and became a head teacher. It was a great story. He said, "I will organise a meeting because I'm still in touch with a lot of kids, now 50s, now 52 years old, who were in your class." So we had a dinner party at his house. 12 people turned up, him and 11 others who'd been in the class. And he didn't say who I was, so I just sat there and I was introduced as Derry. Well, most of these kids, in those days teachers were supposed to be called Mr. Hannan or even Sir, but the kids in my class called me Derry. I thought I called them by their first name, they called me by my first name. So when I was introduced as Derry, you could see some of them beginning to think, "We know this guy, who the hell is he?" And then we started remembering. It was lovely, and they have written parts of the book now about what they remember of being in this democratic class 40 years previously. And quite a few of them have said, "We never forgot it. It was only for 2 years, but the ideas have stayed in our minds, and in our work as adults, we've worked in the democratic way." It was a beautiful piece of evidence. We don't have enough evidence that alternative approaches can be successful. And for me, the real success of an idea is not examinations, but what effect does it have on your life? And it really had an effect on these kids' lives. So they've written part of the book, which is a very nice thing. After I was only in this school 2 years, because instead of getting fired, a head teacher from another school said, "I like what you're doing, we give you a lot more money, will you come to our school and do it in a bigger way? 2,000 children in the school, I want you to try and do these methods with all the 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds in the school." It was about 1,000 kids. So I did that for 3 years, that was interesting. And then in those days, you either got fired or promoted, a bit like the army. In the army, if you're particularly incompetent, usually you get promoted. So I then became deputy director of a school, and then eventually acting director of the school. And we tried to introduce the ideas of the children working in a democratic way, but also making the school become a democratic centre for the whole community. It was a small town, 5,000 people. So when the library, the public library in the town closed because of government austerity, we took all the books and we put them into the school library, and we opened the school library to the public. We opened all the classes to the public. So if somebody was going on holiday to Spain and they wanted to learn Spanish, they would come and join the class of 15-year-olds doing Spanish. And so we had grandparents and anyone could come. And then we had a lot of kids always working in the community, working with whatever was interesting to them in the community. So the idea of just having a democratic school within the school became the idea of a democratic school that belonged to the whole town, not just to the kids. But then I got quite tired, quite exhausted, and I got offered a job as a school inspector. That wasn't much fun, but what I tried to do as an inspector, if I visited a school and I saw teachers trying to work in a democratic way, instead of saying, "You have to stop this or we close the school," I would say, "Fantastic, carry on with what you're doing." So maybe a little bit of good work as an inspector, but not much. But one day the head of a famous private democratic school in England called Summerhill, maybe you've heard of it,
Yeah.
the government was planning to close it because the inspectors didn't like the idea that children could choose whether to go to lessons or not. They said the children must go to lessons or we close the school. So the head teacher phoned me up and said, "You're an inspector, can you work for us against the inspectors?" I wasn't sure, so I talked to the lawyers of the school, and they said, he was a very famous lawyer called Geoffrey Robertson, human rights lawyer. He said, "I'm not sure if you're breaking the law or not, but if you are, I'll come and visit you in prison." So I thought, oh well, that's okay. So I did it. I worked for the school against the inspectors, and I wrote an alternative inspection report on the school and said it was a very good school. And the idea of letting kids choose whether to come to lessons or not, they took a much more responsible approach to their learning. And although some kids who hated their previous school came to this school and didn't go to lessons for a long time, just to prove the freedom was real, eventually they all went to lessons and they learnt more than they would have done if they'd stayed in the regular school. I was sure about that. And eventually the case came to court, and we won. The inspectors lost and they were told to leave the school alone for 5 years, and next time the inspectors come, the school was allowed to choose one inspector who would represent the school on the inspection. And so next time there was a school inspection 5 years later, the report was completely different. Another interesting thing was at this time the social services inspectors, who were a separate group of inspectors, came to check on the school, the residential side of the school, to see if it was a safe place from a child protection point of view. And they said because of the school democracy, this was the safest school they'd ever seen. If any teacher or adult tried to interfere with the child would immediately speak out loud at the school meeting, and the adult would be exposed. So no adult would dare to try and abuse a child in this environment. And far from closing the school, the social services inspectors said all schools should become more democratic. Right now, well, a little bit of history, not much, but in the 1990s, we had an education minister who wanted to introduce citizenship education. We didn't have anything like that in the English curriculum. And he had an advisor, and I was the advisor to his advisor. So I said to his advisor, if we put democracy in the curriculum and the teachers talk to kids about it, it goes in this ear and out of this one. They have to do it. You have to practice democracy in the school, then they'll learn how to do democracy and not just learning about democracy. And he said, yes, I believe that. And he said it to the minister. And the minister said, yes, okay. But if we put into the curriculum that all kids must have the opportunity to participate in decision making, isn't this going to take the time from mathematics, science, important subjects? So his advisor said, yes, but it will create a school where kids will learn more in a shorter space of time because they'll be happier in school if the school is listening to them. So the minister said to me, can you find some evidence whether this is true or not? And I looked at 20 schools that I called more democratic than most. And in all those schools, we compared them with the average results for examinations, for school attendance, and for school exclusions for antisocial behaviour. We compared the democratic schools with the average for all other schools in similar social environments. And what we found was the more democratic schools had better examination results, especially for the so-called less intelligent students. I don't believe in intelligence, but they're called less able or less intelligent, especially for boys also. Now in England, most crime is committed by boys, not girls. So this meant that kids were staying in their schools and committing less crime. So the minister was very pleased about this. So we introduced the idea of decision making and action into the school curriculum. And this idea stayed. It came in the year 2001, and now we have a Conservative government who's taken it out of the curriculum. So you could say you win some and you lose some. But I think always it's worth fighting the battle to try and create these experiences for young people in the school system. Some countries are much better than others. Finland, for example, has the most participative school system with few tests and few inspections, but they have the most successful school system in Europe for mathematics, for language, and for science. And this is in the international PISA league tables. They're the most successful country in Europe, and they do things in a completely different way to England or France or Germany or Spain, come to that. And yet still we go down the road of more tests, more anxiety, more fear, less learning. It seems that the politicians are incapable of learning that democracy works. I see this happening in other countries. A few weeks ago we had a conference in Finland talking about alternatives in education. More countries than ever before were represented. India, people from the Philippines, people from Korea. In Korea, so many parents are so unhappy with the regimentation of their school system. They are supporting alternatives, and now there are something like 300 democratic schools in Korea. Well, if you can do it in Korea, you can do it anywhere. That's a joke. I love people from Korea, but their system in the past has been a very hierarchical, very rigid, very anxiety, very suicide-producing school system, as in Japan. In Japan, there's now an alternative university even.